Okay, I want to welcome everybody tonight as we continue our Bible study in the book of Exodus. Tonight we're going to be in chapter 19. If you're looking at the screen, you're probably wondering why I am backed all the way up to chapter 15, though. Because I want to bring out a couple of points, and as always, I want to do a little bit of review because that's how we retain, by going over things time and time again. And so going back to chapter 15, in verse 22, coming off the heels of the deliverance through the Sea of Reed, which we know took place, looking at the map, somewhere on this side, on the Egypt side of the Sinai Peninsula. The exact location is unknown, but it is without a doubt on that side that the Red Sea crossing took place. And we know that because of verse 22. It says, "So Moses brought Israel from the Reed Sea, and they went out into the wilderness of Shur." Several weeks ago, we looked at several passages that mention this location, which is the wilderness of Shur, and it left no doubt whatsoever that the wilderness of Shur butts up to the Nile Delta, which is on the entrance of Egypt. And this map has it properly located. So it'll be somewhere right here. And we seen that what has happened up to this point is it is approximated that Yahweh brought signs, wonders, miracles, and plagues on the Egyptians, and then ultimately their demise in the crossing of the Sea of Reed. And that process would have took between 6 months and a year. So I want you to think about this. For about 6 months to a year, Yahweh is demonstrating his power in definite ways that cannot be denied, that he is the supreme God. Israel is simply waiting for their departure to come, and they have done nothing to bring their deliverance to pass. It was all done by Yahweh. And so that lasted, as much as, or up to 1 year's time that they seen God's sovereign power exercised on their behalf. Now, what's going to happen is they're going to be in the wilderness for 14 months. And in particular, they're going to be at Sinai around 10 months. And so they're a year seeing God's power demonstrated, and then they're going to have a year of testing. Because when you start reading after they cross the Sea of Reed, immediately they are tested. They are tested whether or not they are going to trust Yahweh and be faithful to him when he's not doing all the miraculous. Even though there is some miraculous that's taking place with the fire and the cloud and the manna every day, and even the quail on occasion. But it's not like it was in Egypt. Things are going to get tough. Their faith is going to be tested, and we're going to see how they respond. So you have a year and a year. And, we know ahead of the story that they obviously failed test after test after test until they failed one too many tests, and God says you're not going to enter the land that was promised, which shows us the conditionality of God's promises, whether or not we will, benefit or be a part of or participate in what God has promised. And so they travel from there to the wilderness of Shur, and they have the encounter at Marah with the bitter water. The exact location we don't know, but it has to be somewhere within 3 days' journey into the wilderness of Shur. So you could pretty safely assume that they travel straight eastward, and they're traveling a straight eastward direction coming out of Egypt. They cross through the wilderness of Shur to Marah, and then to Elim, where there's plenty of shade and water, which would be in the wilderness of Shur as well. But then when we come to chapter 16, it says in verse 1, then they took their journey from Elim, and all the congregation of the children of Israel came to the wilderness of Sin, which is in other places called the wilderness of Sin. Okay, Sin or Sin. Which is, and it gives us the location, which is between Elim, which is somewhere here in the wilderness of Shur, and Sinai, which we know is over in this area right here. So the wilderness of Sin or Sin would be the wilderness area right in this location that butts up to Mount Sinai. And it gives us a time frame here in this verse. On the 15th day of the second month after their departing out of the land of Egypt. So to that point, when they come into the wilderness of Sin or Sin, they have been departed from Egypt for how long? How long? How long? 1 month. Because they left on the 15th of the first month, the day after Passover, which is the day of the Feast of Unleavened Bread. Okay, so that's 1 month into their travel. So they go through the wilderness of Sin, and they're traveling eastward, and they come to, as we've seen in chapter 17, after the story about the manna in chapter 16, it says in chapter 17, and all the congregation of the children journeyed from the wilderness of Sin after their journeys, after the commandment of the Lord, and pitched in Rephidim. And we know that Rephidim is also known by 3 other names. And those names are what? 2 of them are mentioned in this story, Massah and Meribah, which are 2 names that were given to this location because they fought with each other and against Moses because there was no water. And then testing, Massah, because they tested or tempted the Lord because they didn't trust him, and obviously they made their complaints known to anyone who would listen, each other, Moses, and obviously God hears all. But we know that Rephidim is also called by another name that dominates the rest of the Old Testament accounts and even the Torah. And Rephidim is known by what? Kadesh Barnea. Kadesh Barnea, or sometimes it's shortened and called just Kadesh. And I explained a little bit about that word. Kadosh or Kadosh can mean holy or profane, which are extreme opposites. And we're going to see that it is the response to God's testing in the wilderness that will determine whether they will be holy, set apart, or they will be profane and defiled because they continue to resist and fail to trust Yahweh despite what he has continued to do time and time again. Up to this point, on every occasion they have complained. God has simply winked and provided. But now, from this point forward, when we get in chapter 19, we're working our way. I'm trying to get there. We'll get there sooner or later. But after they get to Sinai, if they complain or disobey, there is consequences. Because it is there where God will cut covenant with them. We're not finished with chapter 17 and review yet, though, so let's go back there for a second. So they're Rephidim, or Kadesh, or Massah, or Meribah, and they were attacked by who in the latter part of that chapter? The Amalekites. And the Amalekites are descendants of who? Amalek, right? That was a tough one. Who is a grandson of what prominent figure in the book of Bereshit? I need some Jeopardy music. Come on, guys. I gave y'all the answer like 7 days ago. Esau. Esau. He's the grandson of Esau, the son of Eliphaz, who is the son of Esau. But the Amalekites were hostile and attacked the Israelites when they were weak and weary and tired. And so we've seen the battle there. As long as Moses' hands were raised, they prevailed. And ultimately, he needed help from Aaron and Hur, who kept his hands up, gave him a rock to sit on, and they won the battle. And God declared that at some point, someday, through continued wars, at some point, the Amalekites would be destroyed from off the face of the earth because they attacked the Israelites. Now, after that chapter, which took place at where? Rephidim, which is where? Right here, Kadesh Barnea, which is on the edge of the wilderness or desert of Sin and the wilderness of Sinai, or Sinai, we would say. So Kadesh Barnea, right here. Now, I explained that is this pinning down these locations, as we can definitively do, as we've done, eliminates Mount Sinai being anywhere else than right in this area right here. It cannot be down here at Jebel el-Lawz in Midian. It cannot be. Because in chapter 8, Jethro departs from Mount Sinai and goes back to Midian. And you can't go back to Midian if you're in Midian. Right? It's impossible. And given that they're Rephidim and they were attacked by the Amalekites, it can't be down here at the traditional location, Jebel Musa, in the southern Sinai Peninsula. Why is that? Let's go to another map. The Amalekites are here, and the Israelites were in the wilderness of Sin, which is right here in the Negev. Let's scroll out here. Right here in the Negev, and the Amalekites are here. There's no way the Amalekites would have traveled from up in this area here in the Negev all the way down there and attack them. How would they even know they were there? Sometimes it's just helpful to just read it, and pay attention to the details, because there's enough details there to track their travels thus far. Okay, so in chapter 18, we've seen, though, in verse 5, and Jethro, Moses' father-in-law, came with his sons and his wife unto Moses in the wilderness, where he encamped at the Mount of God. So we know that this could be out of chronological order, but it specifically says that Jethro came to the Mount of God. And the Mount of God is where the water was to come from the rock that was said to happen when God spoke to Moses at Rephidim, where they're fighting about water. So this is one thing we know for certain, guys. Rephidim, or Kadesh Barnea, Massah, Merivah, whatever name you want to use, is within rock throwing distance of Mount Sinai, because they have to be able to access the water, and it has to be within view almost. And when we get into chapter 19, it'll drive that point home. And so we're narrowing in on the location of Mount Sinai, or Horeb. And I'll actually pull up Google Maps here in just a moment, and we'll zone in and look at some satellite imagery. And the two locations that you see here are proposed sites for Mount Sinai. They're not the most popular ones, but they're the only plausible ones. Okay? So one of these two mountains, or at least a mountain on these mountain ranges, has to be Mount Sinai. And we'll see that as we continue. But we've seen in chapter 18 where Jethro gives Moses some advice on how to handle all the issues that are coming up because of the fussing and fighting. So he delegates authority to judge the civil matters amongst one another, which relieves him to be able to spend more time with God, hearing from God, and getting direction. And so we worked our way through chapter 18. And just to remind you, chapter 18 may not be in chronological order. that could have happened at some point after they're already encamped at Sinai and received the law, and it may be placed there for a parenthetical literary purpose, because it goes from the transition of speaking of the Amalekites, who are always cast in a negative light, to the Midianites, who oftentimes are cast in a positive light, but not always. So it could simply just be a thematic or a literary parenthetical insertion there. And by no means is the Hebrew text bound by chronology or chronological order. It just simply is not how they write. So with all of that review said, 15 minutes in, we are ready to jump into chapter 19, and we're going to cover this whole chapter. Y'all think we can do it?
Absolutely.
Absolutely. I like it. Well, let's give it a shot. Okay? Chapter 19. In the third month, or literally in the Hebrew, B'chodesh HaShlishi, which is in or at the third new moon. And the new moon marks what? The new month. So you could, the literal translation is the new moon, but it would be the third month. So how long have they been traveling? Let's look at a map here. Passover was on the 14th day of the first month, and they left on the 15th day of the first month. And you can see that I have on this calendar that on the first day, after the first Sabbath, after Passover or unleavened bread, is that too much? The first day, after the first Sabbath, after Passover or unleavened bread, is the day of first fruits, where they would later have a custom where they would bring the first fruit of what harvest? The barley harvest, and they would offer a what to the priest? An omer of the first fruits of the barley harvest to the priest. Okay? And from that day, that's called the day of the counting of the omer. And it's called that because on that day, they give the omer as a sacrifice to the priest. And so you count 7 Sabbaths. Okay? So you have, notice I have week 1, week 2, the Sabbaths highlighted in the same color. I like this organized stuff. Is that okay? And so we go to the next slide. And you have the 3rd, 4th, 5th, 6th, and the 7th Sabbath, which falls in the 3rd month, which is the month of Sivan. And the first day after the 7th Sabbath, which is 7 times 7, which is 49 plus 1, which is the 50th day, which is why we call it Pentecost. And it was during this time, these days here, that they arrive at Sinai, where they would have also received water from the rock. Why did Moses bring them back to Sinai? There are 2 reasons. Number 1, God told him before he left to go to Egypt that when he brought them out, to bring them back to that mountain. And number 2, what's the second reason? Because they're following the cloud or the pillar, which obviously has led them back to this location. And so here they are, and it's at the time of Pentecost, which is important to understand, because the text does not come out and say that what we're about to read here in Moses going up on Mount Sinai and receiving the Mosaic law, or the law, the Torah, it is not spelled out or said in the text here that this was the first Pentecost. But it's known in Jewish history, and based on what it tells us here, that it's the third new moon, it's the third month, and the events will take place after several days of purification and getting ready, and Moses goes up. So, why is that important? Because it's important to understand the first Pentecost and pay attention to the language that's used in this story here in chapter 19 and following, because it will resurface later on. Anybody guess where? In Acts chapter 2. And so here at the first Pentecost is the giving of the Mosaic law, which as we read Sunday, it's amazing how all this stuff fits together, even though, it is what it is, which is the law of God written on what? Tablets of stone. And in Acts chapter 2, it was the giving of what law? The law of Christ. But it came in the form of what? The Holy Spirit, which is the writing on the hearts or the minds of God's people. Okay, so it's important to understand that this is the first Pentecost, and it involves the giving of the Mosaic law, which is also called the first covenant. The first covenant. Or we would say anachronistically what? The old covenant, because that covenant is no longer active. And why is it no longer active? Because Christ has brought an end to the governance that came through the Mosaic law, and we are now under a higher law called the law of Christ. Now, when you hear the word law, what immediately comes to your mind? Like a speed limit sign? What you need to think, you need to condition your mind this way. When you hear law, think instruction or teaching. Okay? Do not see it as a list of do's and don'ts, even though within any instruction there is going to be list of do's and don'ts. That's just the nature of having instruction or teaching or laws. Okay? So this is where it takes place, and we're going to go through this chapter here in 19, and that's going to set us up for the actual Decalogue that follows in chapter 20 and the commandments, which are going to take us a long time to work our way through. And what I'm going to try to do as we work through them is to kind of talk about them and then parallel and show how Christ has brought fulfillment, and discuss what may carry over from the Old Covenant to the New Covenant, because there are many things in the Old Covenant that translate or carry over into the New Covenant, but not everything. And so we'll discuss those things as we go through them, and we will spend the rest of this year and part of next year most likely going through the rest of the book of Exodus. Now, I said earlier that they would spend 10 months at Sinai. And I want you to write this down, because this will help you when you read on your own. From here in Exodus chapter 19 and verse 1, through the rest of Exodus, they'll be at Sinai. Not only the rest of Exodus, but the rest of Leviticus. The entire book of Leviticus is written from Sinai, where God spoke to Moses and gave him what is written in the book of Leviticus, everyone's favorite book. Not only is Leviticus take place at Sinai, but Numbers chapter 1 through Numbers chapter 10 and verse 10 all take place at Sinai. 10 months. Over 10 months there at Sinai. Receiving instruction for what they will need to know to be in covenant with Yahweh. Okay? Up to this point, they are God's people. That's been said. They have been single-handedly delivered by Yahweh and brought through the Red Sea, which are types of coming to faith in Christ and water baptism. But now they have to learn to walk in the instruction of God. And they do that through covenant. And that's what God is going to reveal here, is his covenant with his people. Okay? So, it says, in the 3rd month, when the children of Israel were gone forth out of the land of Egypt, the same day came they into the wilderness of Sinai. For they were departed from Rephidim. So it says, in the same day they left Rephidim and came into the wilderness of Sinai. Okay, they're at the mountain of God. Remember what I said, that Kadesh Barnea or Rephidim was within rock throwing distance of Rephidim, of Mount Sinai. This is why. Okay, so let's zone in here a little bit. Let me show you a feature of Logos Maps. Okay, Kadesh Barnea. And I don't know if you guys see me correct myself in the group. I had said that Kadesh Barnea was not in modern Israel. I missed it by a couple hundred feet. It is in the modern border of the modern state of Israel. And I gave you a Google location so you could go and check that out. So I corrected myself there. But this location, Kadesh Barnea, if I put my mouse here, notice that I have the Google coordinates, and I can click on the Google coordinates here, and my browser will open, and we see, notice this is the Egypt-Israel border today, the modern one. But let's look at the satellite imagery. Okay, I'm going to zoom out. Here's Israel, the border that goes down to the Gulf of Aqaba. And this pin location here is Kadesh Barnea. Now I want you to notice where it is in proximity to this little detour in the state line, okay? Because that'll help you to understand where we're looking at as far as the distance when I click on these other 2 locations that are proposed sites for Mount Sinai. And they are very, very plausible locations for Mount Sinai. So I'm going to scroll over this, get our Google coordinate, and I'm going to click on this, and it's going to open another browser, which I'm going to move over here, and I'm going to blow up, and your mind's going to blow up. And, okay. Notice, look at this map. To your left, your other left, we're looking at Kadesh Barnea, which is, you see my mouse here? Okay, that's Kadesh Barnea. Notice where it is in proximity to this little jag. Now this is one of the proposed sites for Sinai, and notice how far it is. Okay, Kadesh is right up in here, and it's just right here. So it's not very far. That's within walking distance within one day, like the text described. Now I'm going to move this one over here, and we're going to click on this one, Jebel Karkom. Whoops. All right, got my Google coordinate. Click on it, open a browser, move him over here, blow him up, go to the satellite. Okay, notice it's a little further south because this is the other location. Get back here. This is Kadesh. Kadesh, this location, the other location. So one of these mountain ranges in this area here, within walking distance of the same day, is where Mount Sinai is. The exact location, I don't know, and I'm thankful because they just go and build a shrine there and charge people to look at it and try to attach some spiritual significance to it that is unnecessary. But this was the location in the wilderness of Sinai where they came, where God instructed them to, where God led them, so that they could receive the Mosaic law. And so it says, and Israel camped before the mount. So they camped at the base of the mount. And verse 3 says, and Moses went up unto God, and Yahweh called unto him out of the mountain. Notice you have Elohim and Yahweh there in one verse. called to him out of the mountain, saying, Thus shall you say to the house of Jacob, Yaakov, and tell the children of Israel. This is what he's going to say to them. And Moses is functioning as a mediator between God and the Israelites, and the Israelites and God. So he's going to do a lot of going in between here in this chapter in preparation for the actual giving of the covenant and the law. In verse 4, he says, You have seen what I did unto the Egyptians, and how I bare you on eagle's wings and brought you unto myself. That had to have been a really large eagle. I mean, just think about it. This eagle's so big that, if we take the high number, a couple million Israelites are riding this eagle out of Egypt. Why are y'all looking at me like that? How come y'all don't look at people that way when they are looking for a literal Antichrist person and a literal tattoo on the forehead or the hand? Oh, I set y'all up and I knocked it out of the park. So were they riding an eagle? Of course not. This is poetry. This is sweet talk is what this is. This is intimacy language, which is what poetry oftentimes is. Everybody ever read the book of Song of Solomon? Craziness, right? So he's talking about how he delivered them. Now, in that verse 4, he says, I bear you on eagle's wings. Have we ever seen that written anywhere else? Where? Well, here's the beautiful thing about Logos. Watch this. You can go down here and say, how I bear you on eagle's wings, and there's a hyperlink. And you scroll over it. You can click on it, and you can scroll over, and you can see in Deuteronomy 32, there's a similar mention. In Isaiah 40, in verse 31, there's a similar mention. But there's an eerily similar mention in a book called Revelation. Not Revelations, by the way. Okay? I'm killing my pet peeves tonight. Get them all out of the way. And in Revelation chapter 12, it uses or borrows this phrase like it does in every verse in the book of Revelation, where it draws from allusions or quotations in the Old Testament, in particular prophetic and poetic and apocalyptic sections, which is why we don't take the book of Revelation literal, because it's not literal. Pretty much nothing outside of Revelation chapters 2 and 3 is literal. And chapters 2 and 3 are more literal, in a more literal sense in many ways, because they are epistles or letters where he is instructing specific churches that existed in that day, whom he was writing to, by the way, not us in the 21st century. So in Revelation 12, it uses this verse. Can y'all tell I really would like to do some teaching on prophecy, because there is some wackerdoodle thinking on Bible prophecy that just over spiritualizes and over literalizes what the text actually says. And we should know better than that. We should be sharper than that. We should be better at Bible hermeneutics than that at this point, at least if you go to this church. Okay? And that's all I'll speak on behalf of as far as that goes. Because we've went through Revelation and explained, I don't know how many times at this point that it's not literal. And it's cheating if you take like one or two verses here and one or two verses there, literal. That's called cheating. And we don't want to be cheaters, right? We want to interpret the Bible consistently. And so we don't take it literal here. So in Revelation, when it uses it in chapter 12, we don't take it literal there either. This is imagery. This is euphemism. And so I'm not going to go to Revelation 12 like I planned, because I can already tell if I go there, we're going to spend the rest of the night there. But I wanted to bring that up because Revelation draws from Exodus a lot. In the seals, in the trumpets, and in the vials, the plagues that are being poured out, that's not literal. That's drawing from the Exodus story, because the book of Revelation is obviously about a climax that finds its fulfillment in the coming of the Lord, the eschatological day of the Lord, which is a day of vindication for the saints, which is why he says, be faithful, persevere, it'll be worth it. The beast wins on this side, but on that side where it matters, the saints prevail, and they overcome through death and faithfulness. And so I'm getting very sidetracked. So back to verse 4. You have seen what I did to the Egyptians, and how I bear you on eagle's wings and brought you unto myself. That phrase, brought you unto myself, is intimacy language. It's like a husband takes his bride and brings her unto himself on the wedding night, and they consummate the marriage. And she lives with him from that day forward, no longer with her family. Okay, so this is intimacy language that Yahweh is speaking, and oftentimes in the Old Testament, Yahweh is depicted as the husband, and Israel, the people of God, is depicted as the bride, kind of like in the New Testament, Christ is the groom, and the church is the bride. So it's intimacy language, and it's intimacy language because God is about to cut covenant. He's about to cut covenant. And that's what he's going to explain here. He said, I brought you unto myself, verse 5. Now therefore, let me scroll down. Verse 5. Now therefore, if you will obey my voice indeed. Notice here, I'm going to highlight this. Let me highlight the whole phrase here. It's so nice to highlight things now, and it doesn't blow my system up like it did there for a while on my laptop. Notice that I have it highlighted, and now it's going to be hateful and not highlighting the Hebrew. Okay? Why do you want to do that? I brag on it, and it gets hateful. Yeah, it did it whenever I didn't have if you will. Okay. See, now it's doing it. Okay. I wanted it to get all of this phrase, if you will, because it starts right here. Im shamoa tishma'u b'koli. This is a doubling of verbs, which in Hebrew is adding emphasis. It always has an infinite absolute, which is a continuation. It never stops. It never ends. Infinitive absolute. That is a verb form in Hebrew, and it's in any language, but it usually has it this way: shamoa tishma'u, and then future tense. If hearing, you will continue to hear, and it looks into the future. And hearing in Hebrew means what? To obey. And so the King James translators captured it beautifully. If you will obey my voice indeed, or more rigidly in the Hebrew, if hearing, you will hear. You continue to. Always. Because that's what God requires, is we continue to hear always. If you obey my voice indeed and keep my covenant, then you shall be a peculiar treasure. That word peculiar treasure there is a Hebrew word here, segula. And it is a word that means, it's translated, you can see here in this wheel, peculiar treasure, special treasure, proper good, peculiar. And I need to write logos because it says there's 7 occurrences. There's actually 8. And the other one is in Malachi 3 in verse 17. So I need to write them so they include that in here, because it's translated in the King James there as jewels. So it has the connotation of something valuable, something that is precious, something that is unique, kind of like a one-of-a-kind type of connotation to it. It says, you shall be a peculiar treasure. And it's something that's purchased, something valuable. You shall be a peculiar treasure unto me above all people, for all the earth is mine. So this is a special status for them if they will walk in covenant. Isn't that what he's saying here? And notice here that it's a protasis apodosis, because you have if and then. Okay? If God is this sovereign, micromanaging God, there is zero if-thens in the Bible. There cannot be. There cannot be consequence and reward if God is sovereignly controlling and dictating everything that takes place. Okay, and there is protasis apodosis like pretty much on every page of your Bible. He continues, though, in verse 6 and says, you shall be unto me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. This is the only place in the Old Testament this is said. But where else in the Bible is this said? 1 Peter chapter 2. And we're kind of running late. Maybe at the end we'll go back and look at it. But in 1 Peter chapter 2, in verse 9 and 10 is where it says that. I would encourage you to read the whole chapter, and we may if we have time. But who is it applied to in that passage in 1 Peter chapter 2? The church. Followers of Christ. And he also explains the church as being a temple in that same chapter. A temple and a priesthood. And so pay attention to what we're going to learn about the tabernacle and ultimately the temple as we move through the Old Testament, because these things will be reapplied to the church. That's you and I. Okay, so this same terminology is taken from being applied to Israel as being applied to the church in the New Testament. And that's why a lot of people gravitate to what's called replacement theology. And replacement theology is extreme. It's extreme. It's not wrong in some respects, but it's extreme because replacement theology will go as far as to say that God is totally done with the Jews and it's all the church now. I believe in something that I call emplacement theology, because the first Christians were Jews. All of the apostles were Jews. So God's obviously not done with the Jews. Most of the first Christians were Jews, right? Because when the Holy Spirit was poured out in Acts 2, they were all Jews from the diaspora that were converted. 3,000 on that day. 3,000 lived on that day, or came to have eternal life. And at Sinai, we're going to see 3,000 die because they break the covenant. Okay, that's the difference between the law of Moses and the law of Christ. The law of Moses cannot empower one to live righteously, but the law of Christ can. So he's playing on this terminology in 1 Peter chapter 2. These are the words which you shall speak to the children of Israel. So verse 7. And Moses came and called for the elders of the people. Which begs the question, who are the elders? Well, we know when Moses and Aaron went to Egypt, they had elders in place. But depending on where you place the story in chapter 18 chronologically, it could be the elders that were appointed when Moses took the advice of Jethro. It could go either way. Not exactly sure. It would depend on where you place the story chronologically, and really you could place it in either location, as chapter 18 happening after what we're about to read here, the Sinai encounter, or before. So he called for the elders of the people and laid before their faces all these words which the Lord commanded him. And all the people answered together and said, all that the Lord hath spoken, we will do. And Moses returned the words of the people unto the Lord. So Moses comes down and says, here's God's plan. He wants to cut covenant with you. He wants to make you a segula. He wants to make you a royal priesthood, a holy nation that's set apart unto him and his service. And they said, everything he says, we will do. Little did they know that he was going to drop 613 commandments on it. So here's another interesting feature of Logos. And if you have it, you can go to the tools section. You can scroll down here and you can keep scrolling and you can come down to the interactive media section. And you'll see that in the interactive media section, there is a tab called Commandments of the Law. I already have one open that we're going to look at, and we're going to see there's 613 commandments in the Mosaic Law. 613. And it breaks them down, and it shows you where they're all found. And this is very helpful if you want to study through the laws and see what life was like as an Israelite living in the community. But something that I want to point out here, because we live in a society that wants to label people who have morals or ethics or rules as being negative. Here's something that is very interesting about the Mosaic Law. If you look to the far left of that screen, it says that there are 365 negative laws and 248 positive. So I guess we could say that God's a negative kind of God. And what that's based on is negative laws are laws that go something like this: thou shalt not. And positive laws are thou shalt. Okay? So there are more than 100 more thou shalt nots than thou shalt, which tells us a little bit about humanity. Humanity tends to be lawless and reckless and without restraint, because humanity tends to follow this thing called the flesh. The problem with the flesh is that it is at war with God, according to Romans 8. It's not subject or able to submit to God's law. And so we have to walk in the Spirit as Christians. Fortunately, as Christians, we can walk in the Spirit and overcome the flesh, whereas they had to walk in the law and try to overcome the flesh, but the law actually empowered the flesh because they focused on the issues and the problems, and sometimes they ended up doing it. Kind of like if you redone your flower beds and you have small children. They had been playing outside all week, but you fixed your flower beds, and because you fixed them, you don't want them in it. So you tell your kids, don't play in the flower beds. Now, if you would have never told them that, they would have never thought to play in the flower bed. But since you told them, they're inquisitive. And they think, I wonder what it's like to play in the flower bed. And you brought it to their attention, even though you had their best in mind, but it actually led to them doing it. That's why Paul says in 1 Corinthians 15, the strength of sin is the law. Because the law made us aware of what sin is, but did not empower us to withstand the temptation to sin. Which is why I say the law of Christ demands a higher ethics than the Mosaic law, because with it comes empowerment. It's this thing called grace. Grace is the power to live holy and godly. It is not the license to do as you please because Jesus died. Anyone who has that mindset or attitude is very dismissive of what Christ suffered because of our sins. And that's what Hebrews says is trampling on the blood of Christ, which probably isn't a good thing, I'm going to go out on a limb and say. And I think you would agree. Okay, so they said, we'll do it. And as we'll see, he can't even get the law and they're breaking it. I mean, they're breaking the top ones. They're like killing the Decalogue as the Decalogue's being written on stone. So verse 9, verse 8, Moses returned the words of the people unto Yahweh. And the Lord said unto Moses, Lo, I come unto thee in a thick cloud, that the people may hear when I speak with you, and believe you forever. So this is going to qualify or prove the credentials of Moses, because the people are going to hear something. We don't know exactly whether or not they could hear tangibly what he was saying, or if it sounded like thunder. It could go either way there. But they're going to know that God is speaking to Moses on Mount Sinai in the cloud. And Moses told the words of the people unto Yahweh. So Moses, he's going back and forth between Yahweh and the people. Verse 10, And the Lord said unto Moses, Go unto the people and sanctify them today and tomorrow. He doesn't spell out how they were to be sanctified, but obviously they would have been there and he would have gave them instructions. Most likely some type of ritual purification, bathing, cleansing. We'll see in verse 15 that would be abstinence. But he says, Sanctify them today and tomorrow, and let them wash their clothes and be ready against the third day. For the third day Yahweh, or the Lord, will come down in the sight of all the people on Mount Sinai. Now, the third day happens to be an important day throughout the Bible, doesn't it? And that's the case here. And so they are to set themselves apart, purify themselves, because the third day, God is going to come down and begin to give the law at Sinai. Verse 12, And you shall take and set bounds unto the people round about, saying, Take heed to yourselves that you go not up into the mount, or touch the border of it. Whosoever touch the mount shall surely be put to death. So there was restrictions. The people were not able to go up. Why would it have to be stated that they are not to go up? Because many of them would have seen themselves as being equal to Moses, as is evident in their complaints and their accusations against him. And part of what has happened in these last several verses is God putting a difference between Moses and the people, because Moses is the one whom God chose to be the mediator. Not everyone's qualified for that. And they needed to understand that, and therefore there were restrictions that were put in place for their good, to preserve their life. And so he says, Whosoever touches the mount shall surely be put to death. Verse 13, There shall not a hand touch it, but he shall surely be stoned or shot through, whether it be beast or man, it shall not live. When the trumpet sounds long, they shall come up to the mount. The way it's worded there in the English, it's like, wait a minute, you said nobody can come, not even a beast, but then you say they shall come up on the mount. This is an instance where I think we should go with the Septuagint, and I actually have an English version of the Septuagint. Let's read verse 13 right here. Not a hand will touch him, but he will be stoned by stones, or he will be shot through with an arrow. Whether a beast or whether a person, he will not live. Whenever the thunders and the trumpets and the cloud depart from the mountain, those persons will proceed up the mountain. And I think the Septuagint would read right here, because this would seem to indicate once God is done speaking and the encounter has occurred, the law has been given, then it will be safe for anyone to go up the mountain. The only other explanation for they shall come up to the mountain is to understand that Aaron was also allowed to ascend the mountain with Moses. So you could go either way. This is Moses and Aaron, or it's the people are able to after the Sinai encounter is over with. But the main point we need to understand is while the Sinai encounter is happening, they better stay off the mountain lest they die. Okay, verse 14, And Moses went down from the mountain unto the people. Man, he's getting his exercise. Because if you've been there, this is no joke. And he's not, just a young guy. How old is he? 80. 80-year-old man going up and down this mountain. Okay? So Moses went down from the mountain unto the people and sanctified the people. They washed their clothes. And he said to the people, be ready against the third day. Come not at your wives. Which obviously means not to have sex. Verse 16, it came to pass on the third day in the morning that there were thunders and lightning and a thick cloud upon the mount, the voice of the trumpet exceeding loud, so that all the people that was in the camp trembled. Let me back up to verse 14 because I forgot something. Where are they getting the water from? You have to back up to chapter 17 to know the answer. The rock that Moses was to smite, and that rock was where? Sinai. It was spoken to him while he was at Rephidim or Kadesh, but the water was to come forth from Sinai. Okay? And so they would have presumably gotten water from the rock because there wasn't water elsewhere. So they would wash their clothes, abstain. In verse 16, it says, there were thunders, lightning, a thick cloud upon the mount, and the voice of the trumpet. The word trumpet there is the word shofar, which is interesting because a shofar is a horn of an animal, and this is not a horn of an animal that's being blown by anyone. This is all theophanic expression of what's occurring there. So it's interesting that it would choose that term to articulate the sound. But it says it was exceeding loud so that all the people that was in the camp trembled. In verse 17, let's scroll up. And Moses brought forth the people out of the camp to meet with God. And they stood at the nether part of the mount. So they're at the base of the mountain. And Mount Sinai was altogether on a smoke, because the Lord descended upon it in fire. And the smoke thereof ascended as the smoke of a furnace, and the whole mount quaked greatly. The word mount here, there's a textual variant here where it says in the whole people. It says instead of har, which is mount. The people quaked greatly. So, everything was probably quaking. Verse 19, and when the voice of the trumpet sounded long and waxed louder and louder, Moses spake, and God answered him by a voice, or in a sound. In some translation, I think it says by thunder, because of the particular Hebrew word there is a word that could be either or, which kind of sounds like what we see in the Gospels when God speaks over Christ, and it says some people simply thought it had thundered, whereas some could recognize the voice. So what exactly is taking place here, it's kind of ambiguous. I bet you didn't have to tell them, though, because they're experiencing it. So, verse 20, and the Lord came down upon Mount Sinai on top of the mount, and the Lord called Moses up to the top of the mount, and Moses went up. So the Lord comes down, Moses goes up, and they meet at the summit. And the Lord said unto Moses, go down and charge the people, lest they break through unto the Lord to gaze, and many of them perish. It seems that he's not too trusting of the people thus far. You think he has good reason not to trust them? Yeah, they haven't done too well with any of the tests that have been put before them. They have failed every one of them. Except now they're at Sinai and the covenant is going forth. And if they disobey now, they're going to have to pay the price. And so he says, you better go tell them hardheads, don't even think about it. Don't do it, or you're going to die. In verse 22, and let the priest also, which come near to the Lord, sanctify themselves, lest the Lord break forth upon them. What priest? The law hasn't been given yet. There are no priests. There is no priesthood yet. That isn't explained till later on in, I think, chapter 28. There is no priesthood. The only priests that have been mentioned thus far in the Exodus story is who? Jethro, and he's not an Israelite priest. So who are the priests? Good question. Some possibilities is that this is a term that is being applied to the elders, or it's an anachronism, or it was assumed that the priest would be the firstborn of each of the families, which I would lean towards that, because there's terminology in the Old Testament that seems to indicate that the firstborn should have been in line for the priesthood, but it was actually given to the third son, the Levitical tribe, to be the priesthood. But we don't know for sure. But it says, let them sanctify themselves, lest the Lord break forth upon them. And Moses said unto the Lord, the people cannot come up to Mount Sinai, for you charged us, saying, set bounds about the mount and sanctify it. And the Lord said unto him, away, get down, and you shall come up, you and Aaron with you. So it's spelled out a little more in detail. You need to get down there and you need to warn them. And you and Aaron can come back. But let not the priest and the people break through to come up unto the Lord, lest he break forth upon them. So Moses went down unto the people and spake unto them, which is where we're going to stop. And next week we're actually going to get into the Decalogue, and that's probably as far as we'll get. But we're going to stop right there. Any questions? Rob?
You said the Mosaic law no longer does. Is there any part of the pure Jewish religion that still go by the Mosaic laws of the New Covenant?
Yeah, there's Orthodox Jews today that live in Israel that try to follow the Mosaic law the best they can. It's hard to follow it without a priesthood, and they don't have a priesthood or a temple, so they're very limited, which is why they're working on trying to get the Temple Mount back so that they can reconstruct a temple and resume animal sacrifices in a priesthood.
I heard something about that. Is it also true that they did not believe that Jesus was the Son of God?
The majority of Jews reject Jesus as the Messiah.
That's a pure Jewish people.
Yeah. Amber?
In verse, I think it's verse 5, where they say obey, is that Shema?
Shema here.
It is the word Shema?
Mm-hmm. Yep.
I was just going to share, because you were talking about what obey means, and hear, listen, obey, all that. The Bible Project has a really cool video on the word Shema and what all that meant to Israelites, and to help us better understand it, they've got a really neat video on it, and actually the whole Shema series. But yeah,
did you guys hear that? Here in verse 5, it's still highlighted. Matter of fact, it says Im Shemoah Tishma'u, which is the same root, which is Shin Mem Ein, which is Shema. There's a series in the Bible Project where they discuss this word and what it means, and I would encourage you to go listen to it, because it's just a creative way that they do things that makes it real understandable. And Tim is very, very versed in Hebrew. I can tell by the way he pronounces the words and reads it and understands it. So I would encourage you to go listen to that, because that word is one of the most used words in the entire Old Testament. Matter of fact, let's click on it and see how many times it appears. Whoops, wrong one. You know, just 1,157 times. So it's used a lot. Gary?
Along those same lines, is that something that you read? I thought I saw on the 613 commandments, right above that they're supposed to read the Torah, that they're supposed to read the Shema.
The Shema?
Reading the Shema, Deuteronomy 6:7, P10.
Where are you reading?
P10.
P10, Deuteronomy 6 and 7.
Oh, yeah, reading the Shema. This is a different word.
Okay, that's what.
I mean, it's the same root word. It's called the Shema because that's the first word of that particular verse. Shema Yisrael Adonai Eloheinu Adonai Echad. That's, hear, O Israel, the Lord your God is one. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, mind, soul, and strength. You know, it goes into the discourse. You train your children from the time they get up at noon throughout the day. You bind it around your hands and your head. The mark of Yahweh.
Don't Jews pray it 3 times a day?
Yes, yes, they do. Doug.
So is there any significance to the blowing of the shofar, God showing up and blowing of the trumpet, and he's gonna show up again? I mean,
Yeah, I mean, I believe there's a connection to that. I think there's also a connection to the day of Pentecost when you have the sound of a mighty rushing wind. You have the fire, the tongues of fire. You have a lot of the same expressions that are linking these two stories together. You have 3,000 that die, 3,000 that are saved. It's a lot of neat comparisons that we could jump into between the first Pentecost and Acts chapter 2. But yes, I think there are some connections there. The blowing of the shofar is connected to all of the feasts, though. I mean, it was a part of Israelite culture, and that's how they did their call to assembly. And so it was just a part of how they done things. Any other questions?